for those. Hello, everyone. This is the Flow State podcast. It's Friday. The reason I look a little bit orange if you're watching, I forgot to tell you this, Jen, is because stormy times have descended on the Illawarra and the lights in my room are horrible. It's not because I'm suddenly a huge fan of Donald Trump's hair and makeup artists or whatever. So apologies for that. Or if you like it, then great. I'm joined once again. Jen, welcome back to conclude our conversation on the government and selling to the government. How are you? What's been happening since we last spoke?
I've been well, thank you very much. It's been busy. We've had all of the silver report coming out of Victoria government, so I've been crunching all the details around that. We've had mid-year budget updates coming out. Everybody's trying to squeeze their last tenders through the season. So it's a mad rush to the end of the year.
Awesome. Love the frenetic pace of what can we squeeze in before everyone finishes up at this time of year. That's right. It's fun. It's fun. So obviously we've got a few questions we didn't cover last time, which we'll get into, Jen. But I forgot to mention this before we jumped on. So a bit of a wild card to start with. Obviously, last time we spoke about the news media cycle having a big impact on buying decisions in the government, and it would be very remiss not to mention the fact that obviously the social media ban is now live across Australia. So I'd imagine that's fairly high on the government agenda. As you said, there's been a few reports coming out as well. Before we dive into sort of the first part on talking about buying groups, is there anything else that you've seen in the last couple of weeks since we spoke that you think would be currently on the top of people's radars and affecting their possible decisions that's in the media cycle at the moment? And could be good, bad, anything that's going on. Just what's on the radar at the moment that you think would be on the agenda of government decision makers?
Well, as I said, the silver report came out in Victoria, and so that is basically a review that's been going on since the beginning of the year that looks at efficiencies in government across a whole range of areas. But one big area is in workforce efficiencies, and so they've been looking at cutting the number of staff, reducing the number of external consultants and contractors in there. You would have seen CSIRO is getting rid of staff. Yeah. Etc. So I think that's one of the things that and also the other thing that came out of that is the need for greater transparency, focus on ROI, focus on senior executives in government having a lot more accountability for the programs of work that they are rolling out and making sure that they're adding value, making sure that they're not going over budget. So these are all things when you look at for organizations that are selling into government. It changes, you're going to have to help them build rock solid business cases for programs of work they're looking to roll out. You're going to have to consider the fact that you might need to be upskilling government teams as you're rolling out programs because they're getting rid of a whole lot of senior and middle management, people who've got the experience. You might be dealing with more junior people, but at the same time getting rid of contractors who could have provided that expertise and consultants. And just being super clear on the value propositions, I lean into, how do we deliver efficiency? How do we support greater productivity? How do we show greater value back into the government, which, as we discussed last time, is about, creating jobs, better use of taxpayer, value, etc. So they're not, it's not new things in the news cycle, but it is certainly reinforcing the things that we've been seeing since the start of the year.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's sort of more of a continuation of a theme, isn't it, really, that you would have seen. And going back to, obviously, you and I both got links to to the US, like there's been a lot of that driven from their own efficiency sort of push over there, right? Like I think that's just it's a fairly global agenda point at the moment, right? Which I think is part of the broader.
Yeah. I mean, luckily we're not using the full sledgehammer approach, getting rid of whole departments and things like that for the most part. There is some consolidation of small agencies within bodies within Victoria, but not like we hope for the whole Department of Education to go.
So. Not just redlining entire areas just yet, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, no, look, I think that's where we take a more pragmatic and I think sensible approach than our American friends always do. There's a bit less of the sort of sound and fury approach, and more of a like, look, we obviously know we need to do stuff, but let's not go like throwing the baby out with the bathwater and then probably having to rebuild those departments that we've axed anyway. So. Look, that's helpful to know, because I think obviously in the private industry we've seen a lot of the same pressures, like a lot of, as you know, we do a lot of work with like technology oriented businesses. There's been a lot of consolidation in that industry over the last year. Obviously the big ones just have their annual firings anyway, that's just something that you live with if you're in a giant enterprise technology business. So it's not, like you say, it's not, I don't think it's new news. I do think though that, I don't know if you're seeing the same thing, obviously as we sort of look at the end of this year and going into next year, but it does feel like things are turning a bit of a corner in private industry. Like we are seeing some sort of, some thin rays of sunlight through the clouds, to use a topical example, just gazing out of my window, whether there are no rays of sunlight. However, getting into it, Jen, following on from our conversation last time. So where we left off was we were just about to talk about the buying journey and the obviously similarities and differences there between public and private sector. So I think the three things you brought up that would be great to sort of dig into are obviously similarities, long complex journeys. They're both there in both sides. Like obviously up at the top end of town in B2B in the private industry, that tends to be where the longer sales cycle journeys are. There's more people. I know you mentioned that there was some Foundry research that suggested there could be up to 25 people involved in a buying decision, which is a challenge to manage as someone trying to sell something. So talk to me about like what you see as the sort of similarities and key differences are, and how you think people can be addressing that, given just the the size of those buying groups and the diverse array of agendas in there. Like maintaining a conversation over a long time is hard with one person, let alone with 25. How do you think people should be approaching that?
Yeah, I think, so similarity wise is you do see some of the same similarities, right? You see, people who are in there at a business standpoint setting what the business requirements are. Then you get the people who, if you're talking a tech area or HR or something like that, they're getting down into the very specific product requirements that are going to be coming. And, then start thinking about people who are going to be involved because they're more interested in what's the implementation and enablement and stuff that comes post-sale process, finance people, procurement people, legal people, when you get into the contracting and the ROI cases, et cetera, et cetera. So not terribly different from a buyer group, from a large, say selling into a bank or an insurance company or mining company, et cetera. Where you start to see things that might be a little bit different is if you're talking about a very big deal in government, there is a possibility of having a large consultant in there who might be in there first building a business case. So like a McKinsey or a Deloitte or even a large systems integrator like Accenture might be in there side by side and helping to build that business case out, but also look at, there's obviously, a lot of integration work that might need to happen with different software systems and infrastructure requirements, et cetera. Some very large, again, engagements do get other intermediaries in there, sourcing advisors like ISG. So they are people who come in and actually will run a procurement process. And for government, they like them in there because it just provides another level of probity and, kind of adults in the room who provide that oversight and do a lot of that initial work. And sometimes they're involved in the entire engagement all the way through. We'll actually run the entire procurement process, selection process, and sometimes even beyond the sale, and they'll do reviews and ROI evaluations, et cetera. So there are a couple of extra stakeholders that you might get. And by the way, if you're selling into like mining, financial services, sometimes you see those ISGs and others in the room as well, because sometimes they are legal and procurement specialists. And then, of course, in government, you get the policy side of things. So if you're talking about social services, healthcare, et cetera, there might be policy implications for decisions that are being made. And so they're people who are on the kind of ministerial side of things and policy setting side of things, not necessarily on like the bureaucratic side of things, who might have, they won't get involved directly in the procurement process. Usually they take a step back from that, but they certainly, when you're looking at, that initial building the business case, setting requirements, et cetera, they might have a say in what actually goes into solutioning.
Interesting. Yeah. And I know I wanted to dive into a bit of this with you as well, because I know you mentioned in your notes that exactly as you just said, like understanding the advisor and partner environment is really important in government, because they obviously play a bigger role. Because obviously in private sector you might have that, but it might just be like, there's a procurement platform that you have to use and you just fill some forms and it's usually pretty straightforward. It's not it's like a box ticking exercise. Whereas I guess if I'm hearing you correctly, what you're kind of saying is like, look, we might have these 25 people, but a proportion of those people might require you to understand, what like Accenture's relationship with the government is and where they fit into your particular project, and almost mini buying group style, just work out who's involved in that and what their agenda is as well. Is that right? Would that be a sensible way to approach that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So if you look at, particularly it's like a big transformational program of work that they've got in there, you get the Deloitte's, McKinsey's, et cetera, who are in there at the very highest, like business process change type of discussion. And they're involved setting that out in business strategy before even some of these tenders come to market for specific solutions, so they are very influential in the recommendations that they're giving, the advice that they're giving, quite often sitting, side by side. Because there have been some, again, issues over the past few years at both the federal and state level, you're starting to see federal government, New South Wales, as I said, the Victorian government are moving to reduce their reliance on these external consultants and build more internal capability. And particularly at federal level, there's a whole program of work to build a team of people who are business consultants and business analysts and bring that more in-house so they don't lose that knowledge and those skills and capabilities within the public service. And become so reliant on, it's very hard once you get one of these big consultants in to get them out. They kind of get enmeshed within the organization and quite expensive. And there's an article today about the CSIRO where they had McKinsey in there for something like $30,000 a day, and there wasn't even a report at the end. And this is an organization that's looking to do massive workforce culling. So you start to question, like, why are we culling all these people yet bringing in consultants for that amount of money? Is that really value? And is that upskilling a future public sector workforce? And is that also wise use of tax dollars?
Yeah, and look, I think there's a whole other discussion to be had there about exactly that point, right? Which is the government wants to cut, but then they're effectively, you could describe it as effectively outsourcing governing a lot of the time to these, exactly like you said, like private consultancies, other companies. So I think that's that's the sort of the challenge the government faces next year, and this is the same in the US and like the UK, where being a sort of politics nerd, I follow a lot of this stuff just for fun anyway, but they're all facing the same thing where like they're in the same boat. They're like, oh, we need to deliver efficiency, but then they just pay a fortune to like the external companies to fill these gaps. So you can't, doesn't feel like you can do all those things at the same time. Like you can't have small government and then be like, oh yeah, but we're going to spend millions of tax dollars on private consultancies, because
there's a lot of reform that needs to happen to enable that, because it's that structure has been there for so long. Like I said, these consultants are so enmeshed within these organizations.
Yeah, and look, it's as we spoke about last time, I think this is part of the challenge of governing people in the way that we do now, right? Is like I don't think there's, an easy solution to that problem. And there's the challenge that we all have, I think, is that we, as voters, obviously partly enable that situation. But then because we're locked into certain systems of government in certain countries, it's hard to then, to move away to anything else. Like, I think, the classic distinction between Australia and the UK is like we're, a vote's an actual vote here. We're not trapped in the first past the post system. So like the UK is effectively screwed now because they're stuck with two parties. It's a two-party decision essentially at the top end of government level, which can make people feel very disenfranchised, which I think is where a lot of the, the noise we were talking about when we last spoke is where all that comes from, because it's easy to be like, oh, everything's crap and like the government's wasting loads of money and stuff. But like the actual on the ground reality is obviously a lot more nuanced than that.
And also we ask a lot of government, right? So you started out by raising this social policy, social media policy. That is government regulation, right? That is one of the first things. If something is going wrong, quite often in Australia, people will say, well, what's the government going to do about it? It's not what private sector is going to do about it, et cetera, et cetera.
But also,
right? Because I think there's a recognition that but they're, in some things they're, what are you going to do without them, right? So, and in these cases, the social media companies were not going to regulate themselves, so it's an interesting thing. There's in some areas, when we voted in a Labor government overwhelmingly, and, they like regulation. So
exactly.
It's in the first thing they look to: education, healthcare, et cetera. What's the government going to do about it? So, while we, say, oh, government's not doing a great job, government is, evil, not looking out for the taxpayer, we turn to them constantly to say, fix these problems.
Yeah, and look, like, I think this is, again, without getting too distracted, this is it's a funny part of the human part of this whole conundrum, right? Where, like, exactly as you said, like, everyone's happy to be all like, independent and, sort of liberal or libertarian, I should say, in good times, but then suddenly when things seem a bit wobbly, they're all like, oh my god, mum, dad, what, how are you going to help me now? And you're like, there's been a bit, obviously I've been following the social media ban discussion pretty extensively because as I'm sure everyone knows, like, it's so easy to get around age verification, like, it's not even funny. So like, I obviously, I think the intent's in the right place, but I think the deployment is the best that you could have hoped for given the operating environment, but the important thing about it is it's like massively raising awareness with loads of people who are like, would have signed up to Facebook. They're not like me, I'm sat in like the digital bubble, like I've been working in the digital industry for like 20 years, so like you've got an intimate understanding of how all these companies operate and work. But I kind of forget that, like, the layperson has no idea that Facebook is essentially optimizing their entire platform to just get you to sit there like a mindless drone scrolling your phone, and like they don't understand the amount of money and effort and time that Facebook have put into engineering that just to keep you in there, and they don't understand the knock-on impact of exposing yourself to that kind of thing over and over again, because people just are not that self-aware all the time. So that is actually where I think, to your point, the government needs to be able to step in. But I just think the other challenge is, again, to your point, like the frameworks and tools that we have at our disposal are never the ideal solution, right? Like, I don't think this is the solution, but it's definitely a step in the right direction to address the inherent challenges like that the social media industry is forcing on all of us. And I just don't think people are accountable enough to themselves to deal with it, to be perfectly honest, because they either can't be bothered or they're unaware that it's a risk. Yeah,
or just don't have the time. They've got many other pressures in their life, and this is a not kind of immediate concern. Putting food on the table, keeping paying your energy bill is the immediate concern.
And you can understand how we arrived, to round this off as a bit of a tangent, but I think you can totally understand how we arrived here, because when Facebook started, like if like me, you were there before it was a thing and you've grown up with it, it was actually useful, like back in the olden days when it just actually showed you stuff your friends were doing. So everyone, I think, in their mind is kind of clinging to that whole like, oh, this did actually used to be quite good just to keep in touch with, like, family in the UK or whatever. But now it's just like this garbage sort of hose of just
well, it's enshittification, right? That's the term.
Exactly.
We're sucked in. What are we going to do about it now? We'll just make it as bad as it is, but you're still going to stay.
Yeah, exactly.
Because there's no other clear alternative.
you'd be the same, right? You speak to most people who are on Facebook and they're like, I'm on there because of like Marketplace, or I'm on there because like of my one friend who like refuses to use anything else. And you're not on there because it's a great solution for like a life enriching thing. You're like, I just want to sell my crap to local people, or, you know, your town groups on there or whatever. So yeah, anyway, without drifting too far off into that, I think pulling that back to our government discussion, Jen, which is I'm doing good on the links today. So we touched on this briefly last time, but let's dive into it now. Yeah. So we know that if you're selling to government, you've got a long journey ahead of you. It's going to be complicated. As you noted in your notes, there's going to be some potential hard stops where a review needs to happen. You know, you can't really progress anything necessarily. So how do you start to build an effective program to talk to and sell to the government, you know, and specifically in relation to what we were just talking about, you know, like what should you be thinking about in terms of how you actually activate all that stuff and get in front of these people? Like, what's the best sort of starting point to do that?
Yeah,
that's too broad a question.
I mean, one is build a really clear understanding for a go-to-market, right? Because it is a big beast, and because you know, you've got local, state, and federal levels. You know, one is just getting a clear understanding of, you know, we talked last time about like, you don't dabble in selling to government. You have to make a commitment, and that starts with understanding. That starts with understanding, like, where should I be targeted, right? Like, where are decisions made? Who's making those decisions? What services sit at what level within government, and how does my offering align to that? So that's a good starting point of just understanding, like, where should I be playing, right? Because if, for instance, you sell into the healthcare area, you know, what the services delivered at a federal level for healthcare are very different to the services delivered at the state level for healthcare. Yeah. So just getting an understanding of how government operates and what sits where is got to be at least a starting point. You know, so that's no different, I think, from just going into any industry and then understanding who the stakeholders are. But having really clear public sector specific messaging and value propositions, because like I said, you know, what government considers value is very different to what private sector considers value. So you can't go in with the same value props and messaging you use for a bank, because it's just not going to resonate with government people. So being really clear in that messaging, so that you do get cut through, is really important. Understanding also where government people go for information is another critical thing, because again, they're looking for different things. There are, you know, say publication wise, they've got their own set of publications that are focused on delivery of government services. They've got their own group of analysts who they turn to see, you know, analyst reports on the market. They've got their own events that they go to where they're talking to other public servants. So while they're, you know, they are reading mainstream media and those sort of things, but they are a unique audience into themselves and a unique cohort with special needs. And so they've kind of built an environment around themselves for talking to peers and for getting insights and things like that too. So that's also important to take into consideration.
That's a really interesting point, actually, just before you go on there, Jen, because I think if I'm hearing you correctly, like, would you say you need almost like a sort of two sort of stranded approach here to say, look, like, you know, you will, as you said, they will be getting exposed to stuff in all the usual media channels and, you know, the standard stuff, right? But that's not going to be your main, you know, heavy influence area to be in, right? Like, you're going to have to be invited into the, you know, the government environment as you were describing it. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, if you think, like, if you were selling into the retail market as well, you know, there's specific retail publications, specific retail events where those retailers go and get industry information. It's the same from a public sector perspective as well, you know. So, you know, an HR person in public sector is reading the HR magazines and the HR blogs and that sort of thing too. But again, what's in there might be slightly different. So where they go, and particularly where they connect with their peers, will be different types of events, because it's a different type of conversation that they're having.
Okay, sorry, were you going to say something else after that? I just thought it was an interesting point to dive into briefly.
And then Yeah, as we discussed the last time around as well, understanding the procurement process, because what you do get in public sector, which is different than private sector, is the need to one, have certain certifications. So depending on what you're selling, you may have certain like privacy, cybersecurity, um, sovereign delivery, meaning you've got like boots on the ground in Australia to be able to deliver services. So there are certain kind of hurdles that you need to jump, even from how do you deliver this product that will be required to sell into government. And then you also, the panel arrangements that are there, the procurement panels, to be able to, you as an event company or marketing companies you would need to be on service provider panels to be considered to be invited along to put an application in for work. And that's a first step. And there are a lot of companies who don't realize that, or maybe they've only been doing very small pieces of work that fall below the threshold where that's required. But anything substantial, depending on the jurisdiction, anything from like $80,000 plus, any project worth than that may have to go. And there are more and more, there are certain things that are lending themselves to saying, they're going to look first at indigenous companies, and if they can supply these, if it's a small, medium business, can they supply these before they go out to open market? So, the social procurement element of things is good. Like, if you're a veteran-owned organization or a female-owned organization, or particularly an indigenous-owned organization, there are some benefits to that in terms of your consideration. But otherwise, you're going to be asked to go through a pretty rigorous review process before you're even invited to respond to tenders in the market.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, as you said, I think we touched on this briefly last time, but I think just replaying the sort of core things to think about there, if obviously if you're selling to government already, this is pretty familiar territory, but if I recall correctly last time, there's basically your foundational boxes you're going to need to tick, which obviously change slightly every year based on the government policy, but that's like just the table stakes, can I qualify set of criteria. Then, as you said, you've got your standards, very same as the way that we work, right? Identify all your stakeholders, your buyer group, all the people involved. Bearing in mind, you've got probably some distinct mini subgroups in there if you've got consultancies, partners, advisory stuff. And then it sounds like the third sort of area that you need to consider, which you mentioned, Jen, is like your kind of tiering, I guess, which is like, are you targeting state or federal government or even really local government?
Yeah.
And what's the volume or value of the projects that you're going after, as well as the actual individual application? Well, I guess that's technically 4. So there was table stake stuff, buyer groups, level of government, tier of project, and then the actual what is it, which industry or area you are looking for. Is that a sort of sensible way to think about it when you're building your initial strategy?
Yeah. I mean, really, it's like your target accessible market, right? Is like realistically, if you're a small business that hasn't done work in government, like, are you going to tackle defense as a one-off? Like, no, you're probably not. So
kind of what's going to be $100 million contract? Could I just get in there? Might be a bit much to take on as you first go, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So be realistic about getting in there. Realize that I speak to, in the advisory work I do, sometimes I say to clients, like, listen, you probably aren't going to win this tender, right? Because there's a really strong incumbent, or they're looking for a bigger group to be able to deliver whatever. But maybe you just look at applying for this tender because it gets you on their radar screen. Or the other thing we quite often say is, like, this is not something you want to tackle directly. However, if you find the right partner and almost do like let them be the prime contractor into government and you're a subcontractor to them, to start establishing some credibility, some contacts, some, kind of delivery verification that you can actually work with government, etc. And then and that's a way to also work around, if you're not on a panel yourself, to be able to tender directly, if you've got a partner who can pull you in behind as well. So look at your approach to market, because it may not be in a direct approach to market. You may want to do it through partnering.
Yeah. And I guess that kind of leads on to the next question as well, which is there's always an important distinction between, is this the first time that you're actually trying to sell into government or whoever, right? Because there's a lot of credibility establishment and, basic groundwork that you're going to need to do that you won't need to do if you've got one or two projects under your belt already. So, the comparable example I guess I'd give in private industry is, like when you're a startup, like nobody's got any idea who you are. You've got to do all the basic groundwork, right, to introduce yourself and, show people what you can do. And then if you get into that scale up phase, you're like, okay, well, people know you and you're doing some good work, but you've still got a lot of credibility building to do to prove that you can do the bigger stuff. And then beyond that, you're into established SME or enterprise, right, where you're like, you're going back and continuing to try and win more work. And but having said that, I always feel like it's useful, even if you are established, to go back to foundational basics, because that's where you can be tripped up, right? If you're sort of skipping over the creds pieces, the case studies, they're like, look, we're still to your point, like you always need to, you demonstrate the value you're adding, right? So, I think that's I think what I took away from our conversations today is exactly that. It's like those sort of tiers it's important to understand contextually where you sit, right, in order to understand what kind of work you'll need to do to be successful.
Yes. Yeah.
Sorry,
that's exactly right. And
I mean, they are statement there.
Yeah. But if you're a smaller company, I think a lot of smaller companies have been very hesitant to take on government because they understand it is a commitment, and they understand there are some very established players in there. But both the federal and state governments have been putting a lot of work into changing their procurement policies and practices to make it more attractive, because they want to support particularly the Australian economy and the Australian business and sovereign SMEs, so Australian domiciled companies. And so they've been doing a lot of work to make it easier for that to happen. They've been doing, so for instance, in the AI space, they've been doing, the federal government did an AI open day almost, where they invited small AI companies in for like a networking session, a show and tell type of session. And so they're interested in doing that. And they're, as I said, one of the things they're trying to do is become less reliant on these big, one end-to-end transformation programs that require the big consultants really are the only ones who can handle that, or the really big software providers are the only one who can deliver to those. But by breaking those big transformation projects up into small bits, it makes it a lot less risky to go with a smaller player. And so I would say if you're from an SMB, it might be time to have another look at government if you've been scared of doing it before. Again, maybe don't tackle defense straight out the bat. But there are a lot of smaller government agencies that you can look at where, you quite rightly could be in there with a good chance if you develop the right value propositions, your solution meets the specific requirements of what they need.
Yeah. And look, I think I draw an interesting parallel with software development as well there, because this actually, I think, is where the government can generate a lot more efficiency, even though it sounds a little bit counterintuitive, in that the more you break things down into smaller chunks, like exactly as you just said, like the faster and easier it is to get things done. And because of all the advancements, particularly over the last sort of like 5 years in the way that we can now integrate, particularly like, tools and technology, like the sort of barriers to running smaller projects have massively come down. And the way that we're looking at all the stuff we develop, like our own tools for flow state and the new business, is exactly that. It's like you just need to really break everything down to the smallest almost possible component parts and just solve really specific problems. And then the way you build a bigger solution is from solving the small stuff. You don't and to your point, I think this is where there's been a lot of inefficiency, because you've been employing these people who are paid to think, who just sit around making PowerPoint decks of like these giant, digital transformation projects that just effectively disintegrate on contact with reality, because you're like, where do you even start approaching something like that? And then there's a government change, there's a priorities change. They just become outdated so fast that I think it's just very old school thinking from, to your point earlier, like the way that whole side of running government has been structured, and particularly the way a lot of the more old school consultancies are structured, like your PwCs and accountancy type people. I know they're all trying to modernize, and there probably are some very modern thinkers there, but there's still very much that whole guys, we're solving big problems here, and we'll come down from the top to the bottom. Whereas I'm very much more like, no, let's be aware of the end goals at the top, but start at the bottom with stuff you can actually tick off and do, because
Yeah.
it's much better to do something than to do nothing, right? Like that's one of the core tenets, the things that we expect from the government is they need to be doing stuff, not just floating around there talking about stuff, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And you know, some of the other things, like New South Wales government's a good example. They've been leading into doing more proof of concepts as well.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you know, getting in there, making, you know, before you go in and do a big implementation, big transformation project, just take a small bit of it, do a proof of concept around it, make sure you've got the business case right, make sure you've got the right stakeholders engaged, make sure it's small bit of it is working before, you know, you unleash it on the full end-to-end part of the organization and
exactly
and move on to the next part of the project.
And I think the one of the ways, you know, to round that off, like one of the things they released relatively recently that I thought was really effective was, which was digitally oriented, was the app, the Snap Send Solve app or whatever it is, where you can report stuff directly to government departments. And it's like, again, a simple solution to a problem that they obviously have. Like, people have a lot of stuff that they want done in their local area. Previously, that would have been like emails, phone calls, letters, you know, direct one-to-one engagement with everybody. But it's not something that, you know, I don't want to go and have a conversation about the fact that a tree's growing into the power lines on my street. So now you just literally take a photo of it, it gets dealt with, someone comes out, and like it's much better for everyone, because you just know that the boring parts are getting dealt with efficiently and the actual end result happens a lot faster. So that stuff I'm a really big fan of, and I particularly like that one because I know loads of people who use that now, where you're like, you know, you don't, there's potholes everywhere, that everyone's aware of that, just take a photo, done, it's great. So there is a lot of good stuff.
And that's the understanding tier, right? Because that's local gov, essentially. That really local infrastructure, potholes and things is a local government. And they're really where the, you know, rubber hits the road literally is in local gov. There are, you know, unless you're, you know, apart from like your taxes, unless you're, you know, having to deal with immigration or, you know, coming through Sydney border control or, you know, something like that, most of your interaction is going to be with local gov around tactical things like that. Right. Totally. So, So they're again, another one that is interesting if you're trying to sell into. Local gov can be very interesting because essentially one local government to another local government, they do the same stuff, right? They run sporting fields, they run libraries, they deal with potholes. Like the remit for local gov really does not change dramatically from local government. The scale obviously changes in terms of, you know, kind of size of population and size of environment they're trying to manage, but the services are essentially the same. So that's a really good, if you're trying to sell in, if you get a foot in the door of one local gov, it's usually quite a good repeatable service that you could showcase and bring to another local government. You know, and a good area to kind of start small, because, you know, you get the really big like mega councils and like Brisbane City Council and Gold Coast City Council, which almost like by like almost state departments, they're that big. But you get into some of the smaller local councils and, you know, they're very small teams. They run pretty lean. They've got pretty straightforward requirements. So, you know, they can be budget constrained, but the whole procurement process can be a lot faster and less complicated. So it might be a good place to start.
Yeah, that's definitely a good point. I think that, you know, if anyone's listening here who's focused in that area, because like you say, like obviously I'm naturally kind of lean towards those areas because you can just get stuff done faster, you can solve problems quicker, and like it gets your foot in the door, right? So yeah, I think that's really good advice. On that front, Jen, like I think you also mentioned obviously government stakeholders are kind of hard to engage and get hold of. You mentioned a few ways that you can sort of start to approach doing that a little bit earlier on, but I know last time you touched on one category error that a lot of people make, which is attempting to engage ministers about stuff instead of their actual departments and, you know, the correct decision makers, which obviously if you've done your you know, your buyer group homework properly, you would know that you shouldn't be doing that. But what are the best ways or the most effective ways to sort of pull together your content to actually reach out to and engage government buyers? Like I know you mentioned there's some specific sort of areas that they would be looking at more, but is there anything that you're like, of all the sort of channels and tactics and media options that you have available, what are like the sort of top 3 or 5 that you should be like starting with and definitely focusing on?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm a little biased because I work for a company that engages with government here and runs
like,
events for
biased,
government professionals, right? But it is a good place to start in terms
Yeah.
of, but this is particularly in the IT space, but there are, as I said, kind of government specific events that a lot of them will go to. They might not go to a broad industry event because they're not hearing from the same people, not talking to the same people, but there are a lot of those events. So have a look at that. Um, there are, as I said, a lot of them, particularly once you get onto some of those basic like marketplace type of panel arrangements too, they are becoming much better in terms of engaging industry and having like open days and inviting suppliers in to talk about issues and showcase their solutions and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So that's also something to have a look at because if you want to get serious about it, they are the buyers who are going in and having those conversations. So have a look at what programs and work the government runs themselves. As I said, I work mainly in the IT space, but if you look at like Queensland government runs a regular IT suppliers briefing where they get agencies in to talk about their programs of work. They talk about major new policy updates. The Digital Transformation Agency at the federal level runs regular programs of bringing people in. They ran that AI open day that I mentioned. They also have a great newsletter and a great webinar series that talks about their changes that they're making in the procurement space for anything ICT related. New South Wales government is also very, very good at engaging industry through their procurement teams. So make sure that you're going on to these government portals that talk about government procurement, like buy.New South Wales, buy.vic, and there's a lot of information there already about what they're looking for, who they are, and making sure that you're seeing that they have these events coming up. So that's a good one.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, that's really useful, I think, because we, again, going back to what you were saying earlier and sort of tracking all that back to where we started, like that's where if you are just starting out, you can be super efficient, right? Because like the way that we gather all this information for our clients now is mega efficient to pull together those mini who's who, what's on their agenda, what are they talking about, just to give you a good sense of where to start. So I think that's where, obviously, as we've been talking about, Jen, just getting that foundational groundwork together is so important. And then, like you say, if you know that there's those environments you want to be looking at, it's now very easy to just do a quick, what's happening across insert area from these sources and get a good sense of what's going on, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And sign up. Like I've got just really basic stuff. I've got Google alerts set up for different like big government, New South Wales government, federal government. I've signed up to a whole bunch of newsletters. So there's one called the Mandarin, which covers federal government really well. It talks a lot about new policy coming out, new programs of work, kind of who's moving where. So they're a really good one to tap into as well, just for kind of general news of what's happening from a government perspective. So there are a lot of those kind of niche ones that are out there. There are a lot of, if you do feel like tackling defense, there are a lot of like defense specific newsletters as well that you can find and sign up and just hear about all things defense related and what procurement they're doing too. So I would suggest that, just keep your finger on the pulse in terms of what's happening in these. You could even get alerts directly from the government, sign up for some of their, premiers, newsletters, all of that, press releases that come out. So yeah, if you're serious about government, understanding what's happening in the business of government and what their top priority issues are is, real critical to be able to relate. I hear you're having this problem. Here's how I can help you.
Yeah. And look, like, I think, again, that's super useful advice, because that's where it's circling back around to where we started on the similarities. I feel like that's where that best practice is, it's just applicable everywhere, right? And like, I know we've spoken about this previously in separate sessions. You just need the right information going in order to get the right outcome coming out, right? So like, I think that's where, if you skip over the diligence around the audience, the people, everything you've discussed around the specifics of government, you're just not going to be successful, right? You just need to really zoom in and understand those nuances in the way that they're approaching engaging suppliers, I guess.
Yeah, exactly right.
Well, look, I think that's a perfect point to round off the discussion, Jen. Like, is there before we do though, is there anything from our previous two conversations that you think you would call out at this particular time of year? Because obviously, in private industry world, everyone's sort of in one of two states of mind. They're either in a mad, frantic rush to finish as much as possible before they go on holiday, or they mentally potentially are already on holiday and are just ticking some boxes before they go away. And then, obviously down here in Australia, realistically, stuff's not going to start happening again until the end of January. What should we be doing right now other than getting ready to relax, obviously, over the summer holidays? Like, what's the, is there anything you should be thinking about? Or is it a great time just to do a bit of planning and research and, just set yourself up for next year?
Absolutely, yes, on that. It is a good time. Budget cycles are really, really critical within government. So having a really clear understanding of the budget cycles is going to be important. A lot of them have either just released or are about to release their mid-year budget cycle. So this is just like, how did we do for the first 6 months? Did we overspend, underspend? How are these programs going? Have we reached the milestones we thought we were going to? In some areas, occasionally there might be some additional budget freed up if they, realize that they haven't spent it all in the first half of the year. They're going to free up some project budget for the second half of the year. So if you're engaging with government, there might be some project budget coming up for the next couple of months. So get on that quickly. Government can be like some private sector as well, which is like if you don't use it this financial year, you lose it. So, they're going to want to make sure that any money they've been allocated, they actually spend because it doesn't carry over to the next year. But they're already starting to think about the next financial year for the new budgets that the next financial year budgets generally get announced around the late May, early June time period, which means they're starting to scope out what next year is going to look like already. So now is the time to start those conversations and get in front of them and get them thinking about where they need to spend and how they can spend it. Will be really important. And then understanding, Great. So we've got the big election, the Victorian election is in November next year. So also understanding, essentially they'll try to spend early in the budget cycle because everything will slow down once that election is, kind of goes into effect because they can't transact business once an election is called. And then if there is a change of government, which pundits are not necessarily saying is going to be the case, but if there is a change of government, you see machinery of government changes. So obviously a new budget needs to come out. There might be changes to departments or agencies merging or splitting or something like that, which also kind of resets all the budgets. So, so if you're selling into Vic government in particular, you need to take that into account for your go-to-market planning.
Yeah. Bit of a big flag in the sort of map for the year there to be aware of for sure. Yeah. Yeah, cool. And look, that all makes sense, Jen. I think I've totally forgotten what I was going to ask you now. So I feel like that's a solid round off point for the discussion. So that was it. So I assume obviously if anyone does want any assistance with this, they should talk to you, right?
Yes, absolutely. So, reach out to me, find me on LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn and happy to talk to you. That's like my day job is working with organizations that want to sell to government, helping to build their sales and marketing programs and do market research and market intelligence sort of work. So absolutely reach out. Happy to have a chat with you about how we can help.
Cool. Well, look, thanks so much for joining again, Jen. I think we covered a lot of ground in both of those, but I think all of that was super useful and obviously resonates with what we're doing in the private sector across flow states. So it's just interesting to talk through the nuances of approaching the government because there's definitely a bit more structure and forethought that's required. So appreciate you jumping on, Jen. Thanks again. And you heard it there. If you want to talk to Jen about this stuff, give her a shout, find her on LinkedIn, get in touch. What have you got on the agenda for the end of the year, Jen, on that front? How much longer are you working? Have you got any exciting plans before you finish up?
No, just actually back on the panel. I've got a lot of proposals out because a lot of companies are doing their prep work for next year and kind of going, oh, we realize we're not on these panels we need to be on. So I'm doing a lot of work to kind of identify what panels they need to be on and help them prepare their submissions. So it's all part of everybody's just getting your house in order mode at the moment. So that's what I'm working on with them.
Awesome. Well, good luck with getting it all finished off, Jen, before the end of the year.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for
Thank
joining. This is the end. I'm going to come up with a better ending for next year, but thanks for joining. And Jen, I'm sure I'll chat to you again soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you too.